Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started now. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's talk with artist Saul Hill. My name is Marcy Yinman. I'm Director of Exhibitions and Educational Programs at Irving Arts Center in Irving, Texas. And joining me is Saul Hill from his home up in the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mammoth Lakes, California. The exhibition Saul Hill, Signal from Noise is currently on display at the Arts Center and will be up through July 24th. This provocative and beautiful exhibition features 20 works of art by Hill, who explores the poetic and metaphysical possibilities of representation with camera-based images, innovative photographic techniques, and processes. Saul Hill was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1971. His parents, both artists, founded the first contemporary art gallery in Santa Fe, which was his home base as a child. While majoring in international affairs and German at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, Hill was drawn to printmaking and learned a variety of techniques. He also studied for 2 years in Germany and became deeply involved with photography. Hill returned to Santa Fe to found a company that designed and manufactured home furnishings. After a medical crisis, art became his new direction, and he studied photography at the Brooks Institute in Santa Barbara, California, receiving his MFA in 2010. While in graduate school, Hill was faced with the dominant photographic aesthetic that insisted on the suppression of digital noise, or false exposure resulting from energy sources other than light. He took this prohibition as a challenge and started to make energy paintings, photographic images that emphasized, in the artist's words, digital noise as a texture that transformed the literal to allow for an expression of the sublime. The exhibition Signal from Noise is comprised of works from 2 series, Token Feminine and Sublime Noise, in which Hill explores expanding the visual repertoire and expressive opportunities of the medium of digital imaging and the intersection of art, science, and spirituality. Sublime Noise is an ongoing series of evocative images of men and women in architectural settings transfigured by the record of digital noise, their identities no longer stable or identifiable. A related series, Token Feminine, reflects upon our perception of reality, using female mannequins as the starting point for a critique of consumer culture and the use of the idealized female image. Employing digital noise and other effects, the original images become haunting presences, both real and simulacrums that dematerialize before our eyes. Following Saul's presentation, there will be time for questions, so please do write your questions and comments in the Q&A function located at the bottom or top of your Zoom screen. So welcome, Saul Hill. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and so the screen is yours.
Hello, everyone. Bear with me if I'm a little jumbled today. I have just come out of a 37-hour-long migraine, so my thoughts are a little not as organized as I would normally like them to be. That being said, I'll start with my discussion about the work in the exhibit, and then I have also a few examples of other series and some of my most current work. This exhibition comprises basically 2 series, but predominantly it's the Sublime Noise series, which I titled because the sublime is sort of that which is beyond our perception, our ability to conceive. It's something that is inherently expansive. And I think I will start off reciting a quote, and I'm terrible at pronouncing French, so I'll probably butcher his name, but Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a Jesuit theologian who believed in evolution, physical evolution as well as, and most importantly, spiritual evolution. And he said, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. And the series titled Signal from Noise is essentially a metaphor for the search for meaning. I intentionally chose to use, photography, which we think of as the medium that most represents reality, most represents truth. It has the aura of verisimilitude, the meaning that it shows the world as it is. Of course, every photographer knows that's a bit of a lie, that every photograph is a construct. It omits as much as it shows, and a lie by omission is still a lie. But it still has this sense of, this shows the truth. And so I'm very much sort of like using photography to create more ambiguity, more mystery, and challenge, the whole act of seeing and thinking that we know because we see something. Noise is interference. It's something that is considered meaningless or useless, and interference to what we're actively seeking. That's the most basic definition, scientific definition of noise. That's true in sound, in electronics, in digital noise, and imaging as well. And what it is in the context of photography is false exposure. It's something that is being recorded as light that is not light. So it could be any other type of energy that moves electrons down into the pixel port. And for me, I became really interested in what exactly that is when I was reading a passage about the technical specifications of what digital noise in photography is. And one reference passage was kind of lit me up a little bit, because I always thought that noise was just heat on the sensor, or stray electrons in the imaging algorithms and in the readout process of the digital image creation. But there's another aspect which is called cosmic noise, and that refers to all of the energies outside of the camera that affect exposure in the camera at the time the exposure is made. And that includes everything, including the background radiation of the universe, the remnants of the Big Bang. It includes the electromagnetic radiation that a human body generates. We generate electromagnetic fields that extend 20, 25 feet off the body and are measurable by instrumentation. It includes our communication technology. It includes pretty much any wavelength energy that has the potential to move electrons. And so this really astounded me, because I realized not only could I record the visual, this sensation that we have of seeing the world and understanding it because we see it, but I could also capture the mystery, like all of the, we see a very narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum. So if it's as big as the screen, what we see might be about as much as my nose on the screen. And I know it's a big nose, but nonetheless, it's we see a very small amount of the electromagnetic spectrum, and we perceive that to be the truth. And so I was really intrigued with this idea that the digital sensor had the capacity to record much more than what we see. So that sort of gave me this doorway into creating images that included something of the other, say the other side, or and this sort of wraps around to my interest in spiritual evolution in my own life. My own process is one of kind of attending to my consciousness and wanting to grow, and at the same time, that is probably one of the primary interests in my life. Yet I'm a bit of a doubting Thomas, and so I have this push-pull of between certainty and uncertainty. I guess emotionally and mentally, I am very uncomfortable with uncertainty. But spiritually, I thrive in it. I love it. I distrust certitude. I distrust the sensation of knowing something, because I think that closes us off. And this tug, this push pull, is part of what drives my artistic practice. Um, I I seek to use the camera, which is a device built to fix a perception, to deliver work or images that offer a certain freedom from fixed perceptions. And I guess, part of this was the inspiration for doing this particular work with camera noise, with digital imaging, came when I started my MFA program. We were asked we were basically given a challenge day one in the program, which was, you're here to learn how to make a photograph that no one has ever seen before, which is an impossible task. The next sort of statement was, we have to realize that everything has already been photographed every conceivable way. And so what do you do? How do you resolve that situation, that conundrum? And the only way out really is to try to find a way to make work that is very, very personal to you. And because it's very personal to you, there is something inside that gets imbued into the work and makes it sort of authentic or unique. And I think this work was my reaction to that, along with the fact that I did the MFA program at Brooks Institute, which was very famous for being an excellent commercial photography school. And then they started an MFA program, which was outside of the commercial photography program, but I had to do the first year of the commercial program because I didn't have a photographic undergraduate degree. And that was great. It really tightened up my technical skills. But one thing that became evidently apparent is how the photographic world absolutely hated digital noise. Everybody who was embracing digital photography was obsessed with eliminating it or avoiding it. And those outside of digital photographic spheres sort of derided digital photography for having that horrible digital noise. Part of the reason is that, unlike film grain, digital noise is colored. There's red, green, and blue filters on each pixel port, and that amalgamates the image and the colors that you see. So digital noise inherently has color and not just this sort of neutral texture that film grain provided. I always liked very grainy film. Some of my favorite images that I made were always with the highest ISO film I could get my hands on. But I remember also in seeing work that somebody had, the inspiration came in one day in class when, I had been noticing that everyone really disliked digital noise. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be cool if somebody did something so compelling with digital noise that people would have to like it? And, at least thereby show that nothing is inherently ugly or worthless. It's just how you look at it. But it took me quite some time to think that maybe that somebody should be me. After I had completed a body of work that I thought might be my culminating project, I felt the freedom to just play around and explore. And in a critique class where one student was presenting some work that was underexposed, and he kind of tortured the files to bring up the presentable images. There were figures in the image, but in the black areas there were these artifacts that were almost mimicking the figures, and I thought that was super interesting. And I had wanted to share that if he could reproduce that, find a way to reproduce that repeatedly, it could be some really interesting work. And another student spoke up before me who basically said, she wished he had shot everything on medium format film so that there wouldn't be any of that horrible digital artifacting and noise. And that just said, okay, fine, I'm going to have to do something with digital noise to see if I can find a way to aestheticize it, make it attractive, and challenge this notion that it is inherently ugly and worthless, which was at the time so predominant in the world of photography. But that was perfect because I think by nature, I've always liked to challenge strongly held conventions, strongly held perceptions, and, thus expand or evolve the conversation about whatever the subject was. I was always sort of the monkey wrench in conversations when I was in undergrad college doing my MFA program. MFA, my International Affairs IA program. And so being that, kind of the one who would challenge ideas, and wanting to work with digital noise was a great challenge for me. But it wasn't really until I just did an accidental kind of waving shot at my wife and my son as they were waiting for me to get ready to go for dinner, and I was sort of waiting for them and playing around with stuff on the countertop in my experimentation, that it occurred to me, and I looked at the back of the camera and I saw this very distorted and very abstracted sort of human form. Then I understood, really the power of what that kind of abstraction, what the digital noise could create. I just needed the subject. And so the human figure became predominant. I think it's kind of funny that this is behind me as I'm going to say this. It's a landscape, but it's, the piece I have, the only piece I have right now here, because I had just moved my studio back to Santa Barbara a little over a week ago. But anyways, the human figure became really central in a lot of the images that I did because they were very abstracted. Some of them could be just pure abstraction. But I felt like the human figure unidentifiable, sometimes whether even being able to tell if it's male or female, just this human form that is minimized to the point of, just recognizing it as a figure allows for the viewer to enter into a narrative with the piece. And the narrative, becomes sort of like a mirror to reflect back, one's own intimate feelings, as opposed to something that is purely abstract, or without the figure. An example I give is, so this is a landscape without a figure in it, but I also have the same image with a figure standing in the foreground right here, which is actually, I think, a better piece. It's sort of like Caspar Friedrich's Wanderer above I forget the name. There's one thing that happens, especially after headaches, is my ability to retain names just goes out the door. But the Wanderer above the mist, or the great romantic piece, has just such this great power because there's this figure, with the back to the viewer, looking out. And for me, that was, and remains one of the most powerful landscape images I've ever seen. Although the real subject is the figure. And so, this process of working with a digital camera, is, and being interested in that other, really kind of, in fact, the whole process of putting me into the path of being an artist and studying art came about because I had a medical crisis about 15 years ago, in which, for unknown reasons, and it was never diagnosed at the time, I quit sleeping. I would only be able to fall asleep after midnight, and I would wake up like clockwork every day at 2 in the morning. And this went on for about a year. So by the end of the year, I was largely non-functional, and I was really beginning to think that maybe my time on this earth was short. And that was a tremendous wake-up call, because I realized, I had to ask myself, was I happy with who I had been and what I had been doing up to that point? And the answer was no. And that was kind of a shock and a bit of a wake up. So I promised myself at that point that I would pursue what I was truly interested in, what I was passionate about. And it turns out that was not only photography, but art. And so I was seeking a way to pursue photography, but to pursue it in a way that, would be unique to myself. And as a result, most of the images that I make, even though they originate in camera data. I do a lot of digital work to render all of the noise, all of the extraneous or false exposure into kind of highly visible artifacts. And then typically I print onto a very thin Japanese paper, and I mount the paper to board or canvas that I've done a fair amount of acrylic gesso work to, and then the works get top coated with varnishes, and in some cases some acrylic work as well. So they are mixed media. The image and the color that you see is predominantly still from the photograph, but the works do have a blend of media, and they have a little bit of topography of manual work. So, and then just the image themselves are often mistaken for painting. In fact, I've kind of given up calling them photographs or paintings or anything. I've had people unequivocally tell me that they are either not photography or that they are paintings. And so I've come up with the moniker of calling them metagraphs. And the reason is because they are a recording of something. They are a recording of something more than visible light. And so that's the meta of the metagraph. But they also have this sort of meta feel to them about, seeing beyond the veil of our normal perception. And I also like the fact that then people tend to ask me, what is a metagraph? And that opens a conversation, as opposed to this sort of unequivocal labeling of my work either being not a painting or not a photograph, or it is a painting or it is a photograph. But, kind of interesting there. But going back to the primary theme, there's a couple of pieces I would like to speak. And if I can share my screen here, let me pull up the right one. So I'm going to share a screen. Host has disabled participant screen sharing. So Marcy, I don't know, can we allow me to share my screen?
Yes, we can do that. Hang on just a second.
Here we go. Okay.
Yeah, it should be good.
Share. Okay, so hopefully I have properly shared just the images. This is one of the pieces in the exhibition, and it's titled Mystery, the Via Negativa. And one of the first pieces, or one of my favorite pieces I've ever made in the Sublime Noise series. And this is referencing a 6th century mystical Christian and anonymous Christian text that titled the Via Negativa, which argues that there is no way that a human mind can know God. That as soon as we enter the space of thinking we know, thinking we understand, thinking that we grasp, what God is, we are in illusion. And so we've missed the mark. We've lost the the abilities. So the only way to approach God is to give up the sense of knowing, to take the negative path, the via negativa, and embrace unknowing, embrace the mystery, and surrender yourself, which is, honestly, probably one of the reasons why I was so drawn to this text and also this piece, is that surrender is my greatest challenge. And yet I also know it's the only way. So this figure for me is, contemplating, that which cannot be seen, and moving towards the mystery. And so the piece that's appropriately titled Mystery, the Via Negativa, is sort of, I think, one of the most successful to impart that idea in this series. And then let's see if we have sort of a very similar piece. Oops, this one is showing kind of small. Is this one is entitled The Cloud of Unknowing, which comes from another mystical text from the 12th century in the British Isles area. Don't quite recall if it was Ireland or where, but this was a very similar text, which basically says the only way to approach truth is to travel through the cloud of unknowing, and to, again, surrender the idea that we can know the truth. And so these two, pieces are some of my favorite. The central piece of this exhibition is called We Walk Simultaneously in the Dark and the Light. And this one, I did a few years ago, in a time when, our country was in such division. And I was sort of relating on the fact that we all have light side and dark side. That inside all of us, no matter how spiritually evolved we are, we still have darkness. And to really evolve our consciousness, we have to embrace the entirety of who we are. And this is particularly true in not just individuals, but then there's a whole nother component in relationships. And so that can be almost another entity other than who we are as an individual. And so every relationship has light and dark in it as well. And so this image for me was a way of addressing the fact that we all walk simultaneously in the light and the dark. And when we acknowledge that, it's easier to, see the good in others as well, and stop pretending like, anybody is superior. So it makes for a better ability to relate to the world personally and interpersonally as well. And the let's see, go back to here. Some of my, biggest inspirations in terms of the kind of artistic thinking that I do, it come from, I think probably number one is something that Andy Goldsworthy, the ephemeral land artist, said in an interview one time when somebody asked him, why did you spend so many years putting holes in things? So if you're not familiar, Andy Goldsworthy would make amazing constructions out of mud, sticks, clay, leaves, just more or less anything he found out in nature. And he would construct them in really incredible manners that would last for just moments sometimes. Icicle constructions that would fall apart as soon as the sun rose, and for example. And then we know a lot of his work through photography, but his answer was, he was putting holes in things because if you want to look deeply inside something to understand its nature, a kind of a gimmick or a way to do it is to put a hole inside of it so you could look inside. And that really inspired me in a way, because I wanted to find a way to put a hole in photography, not literally, not cut a hole in photography, but the sort of the metaphor, the idea of putting a hole in the medium to look beyond the surface. And I was also, very much inspired by Jackson Pollock, who sort of, one of his great quotes was that every new time needs a new technique, and that so one of his quotes was, modern artists have found new ways and new meanings of making and expressing their statements, that it seems to me that in the modern painter cannot express the age of the airplane, the atom bomb, the radio, in the old forms of the Renaissance or any other past culture, that each age needs to find its own technique. And, that for me kind of led me to both working with photography and working digitally, because we live now in a digital age. And so using digital photography and then transforming that image digitally into a physical piece is in, kind of working with the base element, the ones and zeros, the digital aspect, which is so, ubiquitous and, in our time. And then also the German photographer Thomas Ruf, in his JPEG series, where he sort of created these very pixelized JPEGs by recompressing, resaving a JPEG over and over and over again until they were just sort of giant chunky blocks of an image, and then reproducing them at a scale so large that you cease to see it as a photograph, but more as a, kind of a window into some other image, abstracted. And also how where you are, distance has a huge impact on how you perceive the image. When you're very far away, the image resolves, and as you move close, it's completely abstract, which is somewhat similar to my work. And so I think, the desire that I had in me, if I can put this back to share screen. The desire I had to create images that speak to humans moving from one place to another also led me to really enjoy the metaphoric sort of implications of very simplified architectural forms. So, for example, a staircase kind of becomes a metaphor for, sorry, my brain still is a bit scrambled, between, ascension between one state of being and arriving in another, or a doorway, a passageway is, going from one space internally into another space. And all of these sort of architectural forms, help to convey a kind of a sense of passage or I'm sorry, I'm still suffering a little bit. I will actually go back to screen share here. I think one other thing, last thing that I wanted to share, because this was so apropos to the way I started thinking about my work, was when I was researching the definition of noise, one of the things that I came across was an article that described how heart imaging techniques were sort of stuck, and because there was always so much noise in the image, endocardiogram, I think is the technique. There was always so much noise in the image that it was very difficult to see fine detail to allow the doctors to diagnose what was in the heart and that needed repair. So there was a whole team that was tasked with cleaning up the image making process. And there's nothing they could do to get rid of this incredible amount of background noise until one of the researchers finally realized that the noise was caused by the electrical activity of the heart. Because a little known fact is that the heart isn't just a muscle that pumps. It's also, in fact, slightly over 50% of the heart are neuronal cells, like in the brain. And so what they were picking up, what they were reading, is the electrical activity of the heart thinking. And when they started studying this process, they started to understand how the heart really interfaces with the body. And the heart doesn't just respond to commands and signals from the brain, but it will originate signals and commands that are sent to the brain. And it will also bypass the brain entirely and send signals to the body. And I absolutely love this because this sort of scientifically, in a way, underscores what mystical traditions the world over have been telling us for millennia, that we have two seats of consciousness. Well, now it's looking like we have three also in the gut, but none of them are superior, that we have our heart is speaking to our minds and to our bodies as much as our brains are. And the question was, why? How did this evolve? Why did we evolve a heart that does this? And the theory that was postulated that I thought was most elegantly answered this is that the heart also, because it pumps at very high speeds blood through our body, and the amount of iron we have in our body, we generate electromagnetic fields that can be measured 25, 30 feet off the body. So the idea is that we evolved the neurons in the heart to be able to read the electromagnetic field that we generate as a survival mechanism, to be able to sense, for example, the presence of a predator or the quality of someone else's electromagnetic field to see if they were prepared for violence or if they were calm and collected and therefore safe. And so for me, this also is an indication towards, the fact that we have so many ways of knowing of information that comes in that are beyond just the mental, that it's like we have a whole, for me, this felt like this was a whole nother validation of intuitive processes, intuitive modes of knowing. And I guess in summation, when I was realizing one thing that is constant in all of my images, because I really started thinking about place, how, say, the mountains, when I took this image, we all know that each mountain has its own presence, and every city has its own vibe, and every person has their own force of being. I think electromagnetically speaking, that's true. And that affects the exposure. So in an intangible way, I am recording something of the energetics of a place or a person in my work. And it occurred to me that, the one constant in all of my images, no matter where I took them in the world, is me. It doesn't matter, camera from one camera to another, but I am the constant in the center of all of my images. So there is an energetic imprint that I am recording of myself in each image. And of course, I can't point to any particular artifact or color, artifact or shape in the work to demonstrate that, but it is something that I feel very, I enjoy thinking about the work. So anyways, I'll kind of wrap this up and, be happy to answer quite a few questions. So should I read from the Q&A, or will people actually ask a question?
Let's go ahead and read from the comments in the chat as well as the Q&A, kind of
Okay.
address them that way, and then we can.
Is there a chat other than the Q&A? Because oh, there is a chat. Yes.
Yeah, there it is.
There it is. Okay.
I think the questions that we might have in there, or the comments, are Stephen or Combs or Steph Combs says, "I love your work, but how do you create that noise?"
So technically speaking, my process is, well, first of all, like every photographer, I used to be a bit of a gear snob. You know, we all fall into liking Nikons or Canons or Olympus or you know, certain brands, and you know, get into little nitpicky fights about what's the best and all of that. That's a very photographic gearhead kind of thing to do. But when I started doing this work, it made me more brand agnostic than I ever was before, because I realized that every camera renders differently. The algorithms, the programming. So this is why I like Q&A sometimes a lot better. It makes me remember things that I really wanted to say when I'm speaking on my own. The camera, because each camera is programmed with its own programming to process the image, you know, each camera sees a little bit differently. And when I'm pushing the electronics and the capacity of the camera as hard as I do to create these images, those differences really become visibly evident. So my number one step is always to pretty much push the ISO setting to maximum, because I want to record as much noise as possible. And when the sensor is highly sensitized and it doesn't need a lot of information to create an exposure, that's when you capture, generally speaking, more noise. The other thing I do is I run very long exposures, because the longer the exposure you run, the more cosmic noise is recorded. Now, cosmic noise goes back to referring to all of the energy that's outside of the camera, that is not light coming in through the lens, that affects the exposure. So by running longer exposures, and by which I mean anywhere from seconds to occasionally multiple minutes. Sometimes if I'm doing a landscape piece with figures, it's hard to go much longer than that, because, you know, unless everything is extremely stationary. But I also work with a lot of movement. Long exposures, I don't use a tripod when I run my long exposures. I hand hold. Sometimes I shake the camera. Sometimes I pan with the camera. I do all kinds of things that often help abstract the image. And, you know, then I end up with a raw file that is, if you look very closely, you'll see a lot of artifacting in the image, but it doesn't quite, you know, let me pull up I want to share screen again to show the difference between, you know, because when we're looking at something virtually on a screen, let's see, share screen and this one. All right, so are you all seeing this image right now?
Yeah.
So this is actually the latest piece that I've done. It's on its way to the Marin Museum of Contemporary Art for an exhibition.
We can't see it.
Oh, you can't? I thought I shared.
No.
Oh, share. I missed the button.
Yeah, there you go.
So this image is you know, has a lot of artifacting. It's a fairly large piece, not as big as the big ones in there at the Irving Arts Center. But what I wanted to show is I have a one-to-one detail shot of this. So if you are up close and looking at it, you know, there is just an incredible amount of visual texture, color, and each artifact, you know, each one of these things, these yellow blotches of artifact or blue, you know, they're not uniform, and they have sort of architectural shape with highlight and shadows, and you know, they're for me, it's almost like looking at a Jackson Pollock where, you know, time and space can kind of open up and you fall into, visually speaking, you fall into the space. I thought his work was just amazing at representing the kind of consciousness that expanded with, you know, modern physics. And for me, this has a very similar kind of effect of it almost feels like this space that is an otherworldly dimensional space that you can, you know, kind of fall into. And then when they're small, it's hard to, you know, and especially looking at a small, I mean, this is a little bit ironic that I work with digital images, I work digitally, and yet looking at my work on small JPEGs on a screen doesn't represent the work often as well as it should be. So again, here's a piece. This is from a series that I was in process, hoping it was supposed to be exhibited before or last year, but the project got stalled with the pandemic because I needed more models to work with. But again, this shows the sort of the texture, the complexity of the visual texture in the pieces. That is something that really develops. I mean, it's subtly there, very subtly there in a raw file, but the work that I do digitally really emphasizes this, underscores it, and also I work at, it also pushes the image into further abstraction. So, you know, that's sort of the general camera technique. And then the digital work, you know, I can't really describe. I work a lot with color, you know, separating colors and pushing the colors that I would like to be more expressive in the image. And then I do a lot of, I mean, I do all the techniques that any photographer generally does to a raw file to make it pop and have interest, but I often do them in opposite directions. So rather than trying to create a very clean file, I'm trying to almost tear the image apart into, you know, all of these flaws and celebrate them. So I hope that answers the question. I think someone else asked me, you know, what camera I use. And, you know, if I go back, if I change back to the other, well, let me show, does this pop up when you see this other image?
No, I think you might have to stop and start again.
Okay.
To another folder.
I will share, yeah, share screen and choose this one and share. So this from a different series, I think the series that has the most, this was fairly uniform in the camera. As I mentioned before, every camera has its own kind of texture and way of rendering. So I used to play around a lot with different cameras, and it made me much more brand agnostic than ever before, because I would work with Canon cameras and Nikon cameras and Leica and little point and shoot. The hardest for me was trying to use the camera in my pocket on my iPhone, because you know, it doesn't do a raw file, or didn't. Now they're starting to use, you can do raw files with those. But I say that, and I did end up falling into a particular brand camp, and for all the wrong reasons. I now predominantly work with Leica cameras. I wish in a way, I wish I didn't. I love them. It's such a pleasure to use a Leica camera, but they're terribly expensive. And, you know, I fell into it. I mean, the Leicas with their amazing glass are, you know, are sort of revered for optical perfection. And that's sort of the opposite of what I'm trying to do. But the reason I did was because a number of years ago, somebody said, if you really want a lot of digital noise, use a Leica M8. It's horrible. And it is incredibly noisy camera, as was the M9, which was the camera I got and used for about a decade. I still use it some now. And it's the reason is they use CCD sensors, which are extremely sharp sensors, but they are very noisy. And so they're used in commercial photography and medium and large format cameras, but the ISO is usually capped to about 400 max. And you know, the Leica M series cameras were always sort of revered for low light handheld photography because there's no mirror slap, it's a rangefinder. And so they cranked the ISO on those CCD sensors up to 2500, and which produces an incredibly noisy image. So for quite a long time, actually, I think most of this series right here might be with the M9 that I had. And quite a bit of the Sublime series that is in exhibition there was done with a combination of Nikon. In fact, if we go back, I'm going to share screen again to the exhibit. And share screen, this one. So in this image, I don't have a detail right here ready to show, and it doesn't zoom in very well. If you go to my website and look at this image, there is a detail that shows the structure of the artifacts in this image, and it's very, very different. This was an old Nikon D100, one of their first generation digital cameras that I had. It was sort of kicking around the garage. I kept meaning to sell it because it was sort of worthless otherwise, but it made some spectacular images. And it's a bit of a shame, but all these bright spots that are like stars in the darkness, you know, I finally figured out what they were. They are dead pixels, dead pixel ports. So they just sort of burst with energy as soon as an electron hits them. And so they kind of blow out, but they have a structure that looks like, you know, almost like a star in a Hubble telescope. And it's a very different, you know, artifact structure than other cameras. So, you know, oops, did I lose it?
Oh, there you are.
How long was I gone?
Just a second or so.
So, you know, they kind of each camera has its different thing, but, you know, for the weird reason, I fell into the Leica world, not because, you know, of anything Leica is renowned for, but I travel a lot. And so the M series and the Leica cameras is just such an amazing compact system. It weighs so much less than any other gear I used to carry around. And so that's what I work with primarily now, but I'll work with any digital camera to create these images.
Hey, Saul, I can share my screen and take everyone to your website and we can look at that detail.
Okay.
Just referenced. So I will do that right now. Okay, everyone should be seeing a page from Saul's website. This is a piece he was just showing, Mystery, the Via Negativa. Here's the image, and here is that detail. It's really amazing. It's so prismatic and so energetic and so colorful.
Yeah, that's the other thing is a lot of the images look monochromatic, you know, when compressed into a small JPEG, but in person, even the monochromatic pieces have a tremendous amount of color that, you know, and complexity in you know, the image itself. When you look at that whole image, it's hard to imagine that there's that much, you know, red, green, blue, yellow, purple, the color in that image, because it looks almost like a sepia monochrome kind of image.
Right, absolutely.
So a couple of other questions I can see here.
Mhm.
Well, somebody asked if I use adhesive vinyl. I do not. Um, I typically print on, as I mentioned, onto very thin Japanese paper. The reason Japanese paper is because its fiber structure is very strong and very different than Western paper. And when I mount to board or canvas, it holds up being wet and being massaged and pushed around, because I really get in physically pushing it into the canvas. I spray the paper so it goes down wet, and I'm using acrylic mediums to apply it. So the paper is wet. Western paper tends to fall apart. Or if you get kinks while working with if I'm working with an 8-foot printed piece, and I get kinks in Western paper, there's not much you can do about it. But Japanese paper really, it doesn't kink as easily, or they can kind of get massaged out. Yeah, it is difficult to work with large pieces. And, I tend to work flat. And so I have to have really enormous work tables. And so, I figured out, I've perfected my techniques of kind of rolling it out and applying a little bit as I go, and kind of rolling or folding the image out and applying more. And then I use the tools that are either used by printmakers in terms of rollers, or often what is better is using those sort of rubber kidney shaped things that ceramicists use when they're trimming and cleaning pots, is very good at helping smooth the work onto the surface that I'm applying it to. Let's see, here we go. Pheromones and resonant electrical waves could be the connection between people. Absolutely. I mean, chemically, we all respond to pheromones and scent and all those unconscious things there, but we are also constantly interacting with each other energetically. And I mean that energetically, literally in the scientific term, like our electromagnetic fields are interfacing and we exchange information that way. And there's just sometimes somebody that repels you, absolutely, like polar opposites, magnetically speaking, and some people you're just attracted to, and that is a real phenomenon. But also, sort of spiritually speaking, we communicate with each other, and this is kind of why I like to say I like to conceive of my work as this intersection between art, science, and spirituality, because ultimately, I think if you traverse out those long arcs of separate, what we think of as divergent paths of knowledge, science and spirituality, ultimately they're going to circle back around and point back to the same thing. And there's just, the more I'm a bit of a TED Talk junkie, and I'm always constantly amazed when I hear the accounts of some of the sort of neurologists, neuroanatomists talking about how the brain works, or physicists talking about how the deep levels of the universe work. It's so mysterious and so interesting that I cannot not apply that to spiritual thinking. To me, they're almost synonymous when you get into these really arcane levels of, of how the universe is really working. So yeah, I think that is true. Thank you for sharing the revelation development of your mystical spiritual imagery. Are you always interested in the realm or states beyond, or is this later life? That's a really good question. I think to a certain degree, I always was. I had a very kind of independent, nonconformist spiritual life as a teenager in high school. Part of that was, in part, not entirely, but in part, that was because my English teacher, I think I actually first had him in 10th grade, but I was friends with, I was in class with his daughter and became sort of friends with the family. And he took a class of teenagers, I think freshman year or in between 8th and 9th grade, to Jamaica to do a creative writing workshop on a small farm in the middle of nowhere in Jamaica, far from any of the tourist areas. His one of his friends, best friend's wife, owned this plantation, was Jamaican, and owned this plantation. And it used to be, it was the first home of Noel Coward in Jamaica, the English playwright. And so it was sort of all this history of literature and writing there. But, you know, what struck me most when I went, and I actually ended up going down with them every year for 5 years, for a month or more, or 2 months every summer. First as a student, and then sort of as an assistant for other workshops that he did, or just with the family. But what really struck me was on this property, it was mostly, there were a number of Rastafarians that worked on the property, and we sort of connected with them. And I was really sort of, I don't know, I was somewhere in between a punk rocker and a Rastafarian in high school, and, you know, a few other things as well. I had more hairstyles than you could imagine, but I think to a certain degree, meditation and self-reflection, and the concept that well, as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin said, you know, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. I think to some degree that concept was always in me. And I'm not sure I can identify 100% when that became much more important. After I graduated from college, I knew as I was completing my degrees that there was no way I could pursue life as working in the field of international affairs, traditionally speaking, because that meant I would have to work for the State Department, or for the military, or the CIA, or a multinational corporation. At the time, I was a little too jaded to believe in the value of NGOs. You know, the Gulf War I had just occurred, and, you know, I had focused my studies on the, of all things, the Persian Gulf security issues. And so I knew a lot more about what really went on, and, you know, was completely disillusioned with US policy. And I just couldn't see myself being happy and working in that field, because there was this other side of me that I needed to pursue. And ultimately, I think that's, you know, I was trying to do something more tangibly practical, which is why after college I started building healthy homes out of straw bale and adobe and natural materials. And then started a lighting company. I was trying to, with my wife, we made stone lamps with handmade paper lampshades, and stone and twig furniture. And, you know, I was trying to do something sort of that I figured my family would be accepting or proud of. And it was that health crash that really gave me the gift of pursuing my own passion. Later in life, you know, it's become pretty evident what it was Lyme disease, symptomologically. And then a year after I got better, my wife had a crash, and she had all the smoking gun tests indicating Lyme disease. And so we know now what it was, and we live with it. You know, it's like one of those things that's chronic, you've got to manage. You know, tends to like to attack the neurology, which is probably why in part why I get the headaches. But, you know, a lot of creative types do as well. So, but I felt like I always needed to explore something inexplicable. That was always there. I think that's also why I was the contrarian in international affairs. I was always trying to explore beyond the easy arguments. Let's see, some other questions, a bunch of great questions coming in. I think Quentin was asking me, do the enlargements change the composition? No, I think fundamentally they change perception. They change the way the work, you interact with the work when you see it, but composition is composition. And sometimes you don't see the composition the same way when you are up close and when you're far away. There are some pieces like this, the piece that we were looking at, we walk simultaneously in the light and the dark, which, let's see, can I share my screen again? This one here, when you're really up close to it, it's a very large piece. So each panel is 8 feet high, 6 feet by 8 feet. And you almost have to have several body lengths, you know, distance away before you can tell that there's figures in it. And that's true with a lot of the very large pieces. You interact with them very differently when you get up close and you're looking at the artifact structure and the colors and the complexity in the fine detail than when you're far away. And I like that that it changes, that, you know, perception, human perception is always changing. I mean, in fact, this is why I love questions. It makes me think of other things. You know, we don't actively see what we think we see. We see about 95% of what you're seeing right now is a hologram that your brain is maintaining. We have the brain capacity to actively see in real time about the area of our thumb at arm's length, the foveon circle, that area of sharp focus. And almost everything else you're seeing is a hologram that we are seeing based on memory and approximation and expectation. I mean, this was something that I think it was Dr. Henry Markham, who is a neuroanatomist and a computer engineer who's building, trying to build cortical columns in supercomputers to mimic the way the human brain functions. And he was talking about how human visual perception works. We see primarily digitally. In that way, we're very much more like a digital camera than a film camera, because we have a real image on the back of our eyeball, is briefly a chemical reaction, which then is turned into binary data. We're talking like ones and zeros, binary data that travels up our optical nerve to our brain. And that binary digital data is reassembled in the brain to produce what we experience as sight. But it's not assembling exactly what we see or what the eyes are seeing. It's kind of building on approximation and memory and expectation and all these things. So, you know, it explains a lot of things. Like, for example, if you're driving down the street looking for a business address, because there's no standardization of business addresses. They're all over the place. They're different sizes. They're harder to find than residential addresses. They're really hard to see when you're moving in real time down a street and you have to like build the street, the moving cars, the pedestrians, all these things that are really critically important. And to find that fine detail of, you know, business address, which is sometimes different shapes, different sizes, different locations, they're really hard to see sometimes. Or, for example, if you're really concentrated in working, somebody can move up to you and be right next to you in, you know, maybe even in your field of vision. But if they haven't made any noise, if you don't feel the wind of their, you know, approach, or smell them, or have some other sense, then you may not see them until they speak, and then you get a fright. Like, don't, you know, sneak up on me like that. But so we're really not seeing everything we think we're seeing. Our human vision is an incredibly interesting phenomenon. So I like the fact that the work changes tremendously at a very large scale when you're far away and when you're up close. How does Saul create the human shape? By photographing people. I mean, for the most part, these are images of people in place. So I think we're still looking at these images. This image here was my sister going up the stairs at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. A very architecturally, phenomenally interesting place. and, the pair of the images here, ascent and ascension. But there was something about the light fill of this place, and, the idea of ascending up the staircase, that I thought was, and just the vast architectural space with light filled elements, was really interesting. So earlier I mentioned that there were two images I did of my family that completely, like, I was just experimenting to see what I could do with noise. This was the second image. I did one of my son and one of my wife, just sort of like a Hail Mary. I just said, oh, maybe I'll take pictures of you, because they were all impatient with me while I was photographing flowers and other stuff on our countertop, just trying to play with how much noise I could introduce and how much abstraction and stuff like that. And then when I saw this image of my wife, I was like, I was truly taken aback. It took the breath out. It almost felt like I was in a giant bell and it was ringing, tremendously. This is a very abstract image, but there is something inherently human in it. And I love the way people will perceive this, see it all kinds of ways, like a Degas bather, or, many different kind of ways. So yeah, they're images of actual people. This was at the Natural History Museum in New York. I like photographing in museums. In fact, I'll be happy to show another series, which is, let's see, I'm gonna open it up. This was my last complete series. Is this correct? Preview. Wait, are we previewing the same one? Nope. Let me close this and share screen, and here we go. This is a series of people looking at art in art museums. And I titled this series, All Great Art is Art About Art, drawing from the Clement Greenberg quote, or quip that he was saying about, how art that's, is always speaking to the art that came before it, either by rejecting it or expounding on it, or, and that drives the evolution of sort of the great conversation of art. And so these were all, some of these are very famous pieces, and some of them were also, they're either in art museums or large art fairs, like international type art fairs and convention centers and such. And they, for me, it's like, again, the art and the architecture, the space becomes really metaphoric. And in a way, this is sort of a meta because, art is sort of looking at the world in different ways and bringing meaning in different ways. And then these are people looking at art, and we're looking at the person looking at the art. So there's sort of layers of thinking and a little bit of humor in these pieces, but I find them to be, like, this is one of my other favorite pieces. Really, you get the whole thing onto the screen so you can see all the colors. There is something to me just very serene about this piece. And, it's almost like the figure is looking out a window. And yet there's that drop shadow, that you can tell if you're sort of astute that it's not really a window. But this was a figure looking at a minimalist art exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And the piece itself is almost minimalist. So, and art in many ways is a window into an alternate way of perceiving or thinking about the world. And so, there's sort of layers of fun. Sometimes it's entertaining to, take pictures of other people taking pictures of something, and playing with the composition. So this one right here, I wonder if I could pull it up. One thing I haven't mentioned, of course, my work being digital, I've been really interested in the whole phenomenon of NFTs, non-fungible tokens. And I'm still like, it's very challenging to set up all the accounts properly to be able to mint things, at least in the platforms I've been pursuing. But this is a piece that I've transformed to ideally be my first NFT piece, which will be minted as soon as I can connect the proper wallet to the proper platform. See, I do think I can pull that up. Oh no, that's on my laptop. Oh, too bad. Anyways, if you want to look from my Instagram feed, I'll be posting it soon. But anyways, I sort of animated this. So all these artifacts are kind of moving outward. You know, it's an image has motion in it, which I kind of found really interesting effect. So yeah, they're created by photographing real people in real spaces, but focusing always on trying to do the technique long exposure, maximum ISO, and movement to abstract the space, abstract the person, and focus on capturing that energy, the non-visible light energy, and then rendering those artifacts in ways to make them incredibly, present. Let's see, do you have any example of cosmic noise such that coming from stellar explosions or even might be from the Big Bang? I don't exactly have examples, like I can't point to something and say that's what this is, but cosmic noise is essentially the background radiation of, well, the cosmic noise as ascribed to, how it affects digital imaging is referring to all of the ambient energy and radiation that moves electrons into a pixel port that isn't light. So a photon will come in, and the way a sensor works, it charges electrons across the surface of the sensor, and then the pixel ports are down here. And a photon will come in and hit the surface of the sensor and knock an electron down into the pixel port, and it gets recorded as exposure. The way cosmic noise works is it's sort of the background frequency, and that includes energies that are coming off the sun that are outside of visible light. It's gamma waves and all kinds of background radiation in the universe, remnants of the Big Bang. It's that electromagnetic field that human bodies generate. It's communication technology. It's pretty much any wavelength energy that is vibrating and vibrates those electrons off of the surface of the sensor, and they fall into the pixel port where they get pushed in by the vibration. So that's how cosmic noise is affecting the image. And I do, to play with that, I started to do, I don't have the examples ready to just pop up, but kind of playing with that idea of cosmic energy, I started to do images of the moon and the sun. They're just circles, kind of like abstract circles with, immense amounts of, frenetic energy around them. And they tend usually to be kind of overexposed. Sometimes there's interesting things going on inside the circle, but for the most part, it's just the energy emanating around this a white sphere. But that's not something that I can necessarily say. It's like, I would say that cosmic recording is present in all of the images equally. Let's see, I have only the Q&A popped up, but where's the chat?
You'd find it right next to the Q&A.
Yep, I see it here.
Anything new in the chat?
How do I create the noise? Well, I guess the noise is ever present. I'm not necessarily creating the noise. The noise is, it's just recording. So as I mentioned before, a long exposure and high ISO, you will capture more noise inherently. It's really tricky to run max ISO on a camera and a long exposure and not blow out your exposure entirely. So I have to do all kinds of things to cut the exposure to allow for long exposure times. And then, but the intention there is to just capture as much of this background radiation as possible. And the noise is there. What I do then is I will work on a digital file to try to make it really evident, to pull those artifacts into really visible terms. So in this image that we're looking at right now, this sort of orange figure with the blue background, I was suppressing creating that texture in the background so that this, not only would there be color contrast, but there would be textural contrast as well. So I really pushed the artifacts in this color range, and that the original image was a little different, but there were definitely multiple light sources. So there was this was at an art fair booth, and the walls and the art that were on the walls were lit up, with one color light, and then there was ambient light in the space that kind of lit up the back of this figure and the ground, and the edges were a little darker. And so different, the way I rendered the file, I wanted to see, it was happening a little bit naturally when I was working on it. Often I get a ubiquitous kind of texture throughout the entire image, with some places that it's, much more developed or vibrant. This one was really interesting in that I was able to achieve a much smoother sort of background blue and a much more visually gritty and chunky and scraped texture. I love this when this occurs. I don't always understand why I'll be able to achieve a texture like this. That to me, it almost looks like an old antique from Mexico where the paint, there's many layers of paint and it's been scraped off, and it has that intense kind of color texture. I don't always understand why that occurs in some images and not others. And I think it goes back to the fact that different places and different people and different moments, different thoughts even, have different energies. And I do think that thoughts are a form of energy, and that thinking, the thought or the feeling or the state of being, either that I'm in or the other person in or the collective people around or whatever is going on, affects the image. So that kind of makes, well, one, working with a long exposure, working with movement, and working with this total unexpected thing that happens when you're trying to record energies you can't see, inherently makes me the absolute antithesis of Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams said, you should pre-visualize your image so that you know what the print is going to look like before you click the shutter. And I'm the opposite. I mean, I am all about spontaneous discovery. I never 100% know what I'm going to get with an image. Is one of the beauties of actually working digitally with a digital camera is you get to look at the back and go, wow, that didn't work at all. Let me change the exposure timer. Let me change the way I'm moving the camera, or let me try to track that person moving a little better, or change something up and try again and again and again. And then there's an image that is magic. Then inherently the photo god or just spirit enters in an image that makes it work. And part of that means I do a lot of pictures. I mean, I might do hundreds of pictures to get one. So a lot of my work is editing, selecting, going through the many images that I have, selecting the one that works. A lot of times I have to go through the work of processing them because they'll change. And sometimes an image that I think is the best, is amazing, just doesn't work when I'm trying to render it and transform it. And then sometimes the image that I thought was, a waste, wasn't so good, turns out to be the one that is good. So I can spend many, many, many hours doing digital work, and before I find one that works. One question, I don't know if anybody's posted this because I haven't read through all of these. A lot of times people ask me, how long does it take me to make a piece? And honestly, I have no idea, because there is the field work time, with the camera out, capturing the raw data to work with. And then, and there's many of them, I might have hundreds and images from a particular shoot. I have to go through all of them, but to really, I'll go get a selection of them, then I have to start rendering and working digitally. And that can be many, 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 many hours per image. And then I have to select which one, this one or that one, and then push a little further. And then, maybe I'll get an image that's pretty much close to done, but then there's a whole process of sizing it up to scale to be able to print it. And then the printing process, and then the physical production. So, and often in between that, I have found that I'll go out and shoot and take a bunch of images, make a bunch of images. And often it's best if I wait some period of time before I do the final work. Sometimes it's years, sometimes it's days or weeks or months, and sometimes years between capturing the images and then finding the best ones in that batch. I find that when I have time in between when I captured did the camera work and when I do the selection and the digital work, when I've got this gap in between, I see the work more clearly. I'm not thinking I know which one is good. And then production can take quite a while. I think, I worked on the two pieces that are the diptych in the exhibition. We all walk in the light simultaneously in the light and the dark. Those two panels, 6 foot by 8 foot, I think I worked on them for probably close to 3 weeks in production, to physically produce the piece, not including any digital work time. And I was working pretty much nonstop, throughout the day. One of the other reasons I use the Japanese paper is it's very thin. So I can cut and construct a piece much larger than I can print. My printer, I can print any length, but I can only print 44 inches wide. But with that paper, I can actually, and I'll go through and I'll make very complex cuts with an X-Acto knife to kind of trace along some edge of transition from, in this case, like blue to this orange, and, kind of do a very complex kind of cut so that when there's a seam there, it blends into what's going on in the image. And that's how I'll build a really large piece. And then I have to kind of back paint it so that it doesn't darken with an overlap. It's a bit of a complex process, but so anyways, yes.
Well, we are coming to the end of our time. Some really great questions, everyone. Thank you so much. Good questions, good comments. We are going to need to conclude shortly. I do have some closing remarks. Sal, is there anything else you would like to say or address, or any wisdom to impart upon us?
Not really. I just think that I hope that my work in a way inspires you to, to realize that life is, and our own consciousness is an incredibly mysterious process, and that, reality is something that is, we can evolve ever towards. We'll never get there. It's going to be the truth, the big thing, whatever name you want to give it, whether it be God or I don't know, Einstein, well, he never got the integrated theory of everything, but whatever path of knowledge you're traveling, there is always more, and it's always inclusive of other ways of thinking and seeing. So I hope my work inspires people to, to kind of have a moment to realize that there is something grandly mysterious out there, and that we can, I mean, hopefully we move towards it, and we can enjoy the process.
Absolutely. I think your work is an incredible sort of gateway for us to contemplate the mysteries of perception and of being, and of really relating to the phenomenon of existence and our place in it. So thank you so much, Saul. I remind everyone that Saul Hill's Signal from Noise will be on exhibit in the Arts Center through July 14th. You may also virtually visit the exhibition at any time. Please go to our website, irvingartscenter.com, and look for our 360-degree gallery tours. So I conclude with many thanks to all of you for attending today. You've been a great audience, great participants. I also thank the Irving Arts Board, our Executive Director, Todd Eric Hawkins, my colleague and Programs Assistant and Tech Support, Cindy Pereira. Many thanks to Catherine T. Carter and Associates and Jen Dragon. And of course to you, Saul Hill, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and to speak about your work. Okay, everyone, thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.